right, good afternoon. My name is Joseph Tucker Edmonds, and I'm the Associate Director of the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture. Welcome to the second episode of the fifth season of the Center's Religion And series. Religion And is a series of monthly conversations between leading academics and practitioners and community members hosted by the Center to engage and enhance critically important conversations on the state of religion and American culture. And this is just one piece of the important work that the center here is doing to address and engage religion and American culture and the issues that are facing us around the world. The last episode was an engaging and far-reaching conversation on religion and anti-Semitism. I want to thank Dr. Lincoln Mullen, Dr. John Turner, Dr. Sarah Imhoff, and Dr. Britt Tevis. If you didn't get a chance to watch that episode, please check it out on our YouTube channel or at our website. And if you just want to listen to this or any of our upcoming episodes, we are now available everywhere you download your favorite podcasts. I want to remind folks that the panelists have updated resources and syllabi and videos to the notes page of the episode. And there's so many excellent resources to share with your students and community members and to continue this important conversation. We started this season with a wide-ranging discussion on anti-Semitism, and following this episode, we're going to have a critical encounter with the 2024 elections, because our goal this year is to explore the nuance and complexity and the ways that these and many other topics inform and shape religion and American culture and many other themes that interact with that. So please remember, as we start today's conversation, that throughout today's session, we are asking folks to submit your questions through the Q&A feature on Zoom. At the end of today's conversation, we will open it up and engage questions from the audience, and we will love for you to be able to drop those questions into the Q&A feature, as the chat feature will not be on or accessible during today's episode. During this afternoon's episode, panelists will address the history of the concept of Islamophobia, its impact on American Muslims, and what other concepts might better explain or better unfold the historical and contemporary moments that we face currently. And so I'm so excited that we have today a group of panelists that will allow us to engage at the intersection of religion, Islamophobia, higher education, and American culture. I want to introduce to you our panelists, and then I'm going to hand it off to our host, Dr. Khadija Kaja, to facilitate this important conversation. Our host is Dr. Khadija Kaja. She is an associate professor of social work at Indiana University, Indianapolis. Her research interests include building inclusive teaching and learning climates, international social work practice, Islamophobia, Muslim social work needs, the bullying of Muslims, civil discourse in higher education, the practice of female circumcision, and addressing the growth of white nationalist movement, all while thinking about this in online communities and across and in different and diverse pedagogical spaces. So please join me in welcoming our host, Dr. Khadija Kaja. Our panelists who will be joining Dr. Khadija Kaja are first Dr. Zarina Grewal, who is an associate professor of American Studies, Ethnicity, Race and Migration, and Religious Studies at Yale University. She is a historical anthropologist and a documentarian and documentary filmmaker whose research focuses on race, gender, religion, nationalism, and transnationalism across a wide spectrum of American Muslim communities. Her first book was Islam is a Foreign Country, American Muslims and the Global Crisis of Authority, and it was an ethnography of transnational Muslim networks that links U.S. mosques to Islamic movements in the post-colonial moment through debates about the reform of Islam. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Grewal to our conversation today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yes, our additional panelist is Mr. Talha Kaf. Talha is a senior at the Indiana University School of Social Work. He is a Muslim Syrian living in the Midwest. Born to a mother who came from a refugee background, Talha grew up learning to identify structural gaps in society. Along this journey, Talha and his family experienced Islamophobia within education, healthcare, and legal systems. Within each of these experiences, Talha has developed his personal values and has begun on a journey of ancestral connections and decolonization. And so we're so excited to have a student join us today, Mr. Talha Ka. And the final panelist who will be joining us today is Dr. Kayla Renee Wheeler. Dr. Wheeler is an assistant professor of critical ethnic studies and theology and a part of the Africana Studies program and serves as its director at Xavier University in Cincinnati, Ohio. Dr. Wheeler is an expert in Black Islam, Islamic bioethics, and digital religion. Currently, she is writing a book entitled Fashioning Black Islam, which provides a history of Black Muslim fashion in the United States from the 1930s to the present. She is the author of the Digital Humanities Project, Mapping Malcolm's Boston, which explores Malcolm X's life in Boston from the 1940s to 1950s. And she is the curator of the award-winning Black Islam syllabus. So it is with so much excitement that I'm able to welcome Dr. Wheeler, Mr. Koff, Dr. Graywall, and Dr. Khadija Kaja to have this important conversation. So I will hand it over to Dr. Khadija to begin this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your leadership, Dr. Edmonds, in organizing this forum and the one on anti-Semitism in light of the events that are happening around the world, that for many people, understandably, there is a lot of raw trauma and emotion. And so I want to state that up front. We do this forum today coming from a place of love and compassion for common humanity. And thank you again. It'll be a dialogue format. And so I will start with the first question, and I will ask Dr. Wheeler, how do you define Islamophobia?
So I would say Islamophobia is kind of this dual approach. It's both the interpersonal and structural othering of Muslims and also people who are perceived to be Muslims. So that would be Sikh people, people of color, especially Black people and brown Arabs and South Asians. And this othering of Muslims leads to their safety, their security, their livelihoods, and in some cases, their citizenship being in a constant state of flux.
Thank you so much. Dr. Graywall, did you want to add anything to that?
I would just say that a couple years back, several of us came together and formed a syllabus called the Islamophobia is Racism syllabus, building on actually Kayla's work, building her Black Islam syllabus and other syllabi like the Ferguson syllabus, the Standing Rock syllabus. And basically, the argument is in the title that we want to reframe Islamophobia as anti-Muslim racism for a few reasons. One is that the language of phobia can be too individualizing. It suggests that the discrimination is solely a problem of individual bias. And so in order to kind of capture that structural and systemic production of racism against Muslim populations and people who are perceived as Muslim, as Bush famously said, Muslim looking, right? We wanted to kind of think about anti-Muslim racism as an alternate term. And, building there on I just think my kind of working definition of racism is just Ruthie Wilson Gilmore's, famous definition of racism, which is racism is the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group differentiated vulnerability to premature death. So that's kind of a really simple, elegant way of talking about what structural racism is, and that can be applied to both racialized populations as well as religious communities that are racialized as Muslims are. But for better or for worse, Islamophobia is the term that is the term of the day. And so I think rather than begging people to kind of use anti-Muslim racism instead, I don't think that's very productive, but just to kind of always highlight that anti-Muslim racism or Islamophobia is connecting, many different forms of racism, including, anti-Black racism, anti-Latinx racism, anti-Arab racism, anti-South Asian racism, and other forms. And they're not all the same. They're often overlapping, but they're not always the same and that there is a kind of, in this country at least, a foundational, anti-Blackness that is at the core of anti-Muslim racism. And then, of course, today we're grappling with, anti-Palestinian racism in a much more explicit way with the war that's happening. And I would just say that, one of the things that I hope we can talk about today is sometimes how the term Islamophobia can actually obfuscate or distract us from the specificities of anti-Palestinian racism. So maybe we can get into that in a little bit.
Tala, who is a BSW undergraduate student in our campus, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Sure, yeah, not too much, but that was very insightful. Thank you, you too. When I saw that question, I was struggling to put something to it because I feel like if I were to define something, then I immediately put limits on it. So this took it took some thinking, but I would define it as an experience, just to put it lightly. I would when you perpetrate Islamophobia, you are conjuring the experience of oppression. And I really like what you're saying, Dr. Graywall, about anti-Muslim racism, because I feel like calling it racism acknowledges the systemic properties of Islamophobia and doesn't limit it to that, individual bias or individual experience that each Muslim may have.
Thank you. Tala, actually, I might stay with you on this one, particularly because you're a student in higher education. What does, if you are comfortable sharing, what does Islamophobia look like in the daily lives of Muslims? I know you're a young person, but is there anything you wanted to share? Or did you have thoughts on that?
Sure. The way I would describe Islamophobia in daily lives would be kind of like your shadow on the ground as you're walking. Like sometimes, shadows grow and shrink throughout the day. Sometimes they're right in front of us, so blatant and obvious, and sometimes you have to kind of peer over your shoulder in order to see it. And I would describe Islamophobia the same way. It can look very intimidating, very frightening, very blunt in your face, and sometimes is a lot more covert and subtle through microaggressions. And this is where your mind does mental gymnastics to try to assess if what you are feeling is valid and thinking that it is in fact the experience of Islamophobia. And all of this daily, it can be exhausting. Some Muslims become discouraged to go out and vote in elections when they experience this shadow grow and shrink in politics. The same with if they experience Islamophobia in the classroom, and they're that shadow, again, to kind of use more of that poetic language, challenging their teachers or their students or even their curriculum in the classroom can also become discouraging advocating for themselves during Ramadan when we're fasting, and being Muslim is much more we're louder about our identity in Ramadan. And for other Muslims, it's the opposite. Resistance becomes the legacy that they want to leave behind, especially when Islamophobia is recognized as something through the education system and legal system and healthcare system and so on.
Dr. Wheeler, thank you. Would you like to add something to that? Any thoughts?
Well, that was beautifully said. The one thing I will add is the way that race can impact how people experience Islamophobia. So just speaking about the Black American experience, a lot of times Black Americans face Islamophobia both from non-Muslims as well as Muslims themselves. There's this belief that African American Muslims in particular are not real Muslims. So either they're converts or they're in the Nation of Islam or another minority Muslim group. And so they cannot possibly represent Islam, or they can't speak for Muslims or advocate for that. So there's that aspect. But something that I've seen a lot more recently leading up to the election, especially within the Black community, is challenging Black Muslims to choose which identity should come first, whether they are Black or they are Muslim first, not understanding how those are intersecting identities. So you have this push and pull from Black non-Muslims as well as non-Black Muslims.
Thank you. Very powerfully framed. Dr. Gerwal, any thoughts you'd like to add to that?
I would just, say just to kind of build on, what Kayla just mentioned about Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism isn't experienced evenly across the community. Certain elements of these communities are more vulnerable than others. So if you live in an ethnic enclave in Devon Street in Chicago or Dearborn, Michigan, or in parts of Queens or Brooklyn, New York, post 9/11, those were the communities that were the most heavily surveilled and receiving the most kind of state violence relative to people that lived in the suburbs. So, similarly, people that have citizenship status are less vulnerable in many ways to state violence than people who are undocumented. There's all kinds of things, but it's also not stable because racism is never stable. So, my husband is Iraqi, and when our children were small, our sons were blonde, and when I walk around, people would be surprised that I had a blonde baby. But when we were at the airport, even though I'm darker, I'm visibly racialized in a way that my babies were not. When we go to the airport, they were the ones that would get flagged by the TSA. Because they have Arab last names. So it's not one thing. It's not what you look like. It's not whether you have an accent or not. It's just so many different things, because Garewal is a Punjabi name. Most people would assume that I'm Sikh because my family was Sikh 200 years ago. So I'm not seen as Muslim. If you're being racialized by your name, I'm not racialized the way that my children are because they have an Arabic last name. And the person that's racially profiling them might often be a Muslim employee of the TSA. So it's a system. They don't have to, the TSA agent doesn't have to have an individual feelings of bigotry or anti-Muslim feeling to be the enactment of that racism. So that's just something that I would also, bring to our attention, that, that these, of course, like the women who wear hijab, like what does a visibly Muslim person look like? The same thing. It's just like names, whether they wear hijab or not, whether they have a beard, whether they have an accent, what their name is, all these different factors are. One of my blondes is just coming right into the room to shoo him away. Sorry. But that's just something that's constantly being sort of reformulated. And so that there is no stable set of markings that mark any particular Muslim person.
Thank you. You give the important point about the intersections of Muslims or people that are perceived as Muslim, who may not be Muslim, and how Muslims are supposed to look, and how we label sort of the look of a Muslim. I wanted to ask, particularly given the depth of Islamophobia that's happening these days, and along with anti-Semitism. And I had this question to all of you. Dr. Wheeler, I don't know if you can expand. How are Muslims coping with it, do you think, in your work, with Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism, whatever word we want to use?
I think it really depends on the community here, where I'm based in Cincinnati. I'm seeing a lot of Muslims turning inward to build community, strengthen bonds, relying on the Quran, relying on the long history of Muslim activism in this country. I'm seeing people fighting back, not being comfortable with the status quo, saying that you cannot practice your religion openly. What's been surprising is to see how little support, at least I've seen, for younger Muslims outside of non-Muslim communities. There's no space for Muslims and people who are perceived to be Muslims to express their concerns about what's happening in this country, but also what's happening in Palestine and the Sudan. It kind of seems like to point out Islamophobia is perceived to be anti-Semitic. But it has a very, very different vibe. For me, I remember growing up, I was 12 years old when 9/11 happened. I feel like this is a kind of a different moment. It might be because I'm older, but this moment feels a lot different than 9/11 did.
Why does it feel different?
I think people are less afraid. I remember people buying American flags. or having like American hijabs and showing their citizenship, wanting to prove that they are American so they can be safe. And I think people are starting to realize, especially non-Black Muslims, that there was never any safety, and that the only people who are going to fight for Muslims and people perceived to be Muslims are those people themselves. So really trying to stand up. And that has led to people being arrested, being kicked out of their universities, being suspended. There's a student at Cornell who the administration tried to deport for his support of Palestinian activists.
Thank you. Speaking of students, and Thala, you are here, you are a student. From a human point of view, and we're all teachers, many of us on this call are teachers, how do you personally cope with Islamophobia? Or how do you think your peers who are Muslim cope with Islamophobia? What have you seen?
Sure. A lot of what's coming to mind is aligning with what Dr. Wheeler was just saying, where many of them have, and including myself, have turned inward and have like relied on communities. I'd also like to name that like some of us have not, and or some of us go through at least like phases where we don't, because it from from a lived experience point of view, it can sometimes feel like a life sentence when you're Muslim in this country, where like you can't turn it off. So sometimes you lean to what you can control. Like if I'm not gonna leave my community, I'm not gonna leave the religion, then there are other things that I might leave behind that I feel more comfortable with, and that might even like include doing something that isn't in alignment with some of my other values. It's like it's very human in that, I guess, is the best way to describe it. Like there is no, at least none of my peers or the people that I've come across in my generation who are Muslim, none of us feel like there is an answer. And I personally don't feel like there is ever going to be one, because that's part of just being human, is nothing's always going to work. That just part of science. Like nothing is always going to, when we think of a coping skill, like in social work, coping skills sometimes work for this problem, sometimes don't work for that problem, but might work for another one. We see the same in medicine, where like we'll keep taking medicine, but then find out it's actually treating a different issue that we have in our body. So I see this the same way as well, as when it's this constant like trial and error of seeing what works, what is going to make us feel safe in our university. When we see things, when we see a pattern where things aren't working, I can say from like my personal experience, sometimes like if I continue to feel like, for example, just not safe in my university, then I will feel much more comfortable doing things. It's almost like when someone feels like they don't have as much in jeopardy anymore. If they feel like they can, like in Bloomington, hijabis were run over by a car because they were wearing a hijab on our Bloomington campus for Indiana University. So when you feel like your life is at stake at that point because of your identity, for some people, it can almost feel liberating, because now I can practice it so authentically that I have nothing, like I don't feel like I need to filter anything anymore, because already at the state that I'm at, people want me dead, if that makes sense.
Thank you for the deeply powerful sharing that you did. Dr. Graywall, as you know, anti-Semitism and anti-Islamophobic incidents, violent incidents, hate crimes have surged the past year in the United States and globally. The Council of American Islamic Relations, in its 2024 report focusing on Muslims, stated there was a 56% jump in Islamophobic incidents reported to them in the United States during the year 2023, the highest recorded in its 30-year history. Half of the complaints in 2023 to them were reported in the final 3 months of 2023. Could you share your thoughts between the incidents that are happening in the Middle East and its relationship to the surge in Islamophobia that we are seeing here, even though we are so far away? What your thoughts are on that?
Yeah, I mean, so I will just say that, as somebody who does think about both qualitative and quantitative data when it comes to racism, anti-racism, anti-Semitism, I would just say that, we don't really have a strong picture because, for example, the statistics around anti-Semitism, some of those numbers include incidents of someone simply being critical of Israel as counting as anti-Semitic. Other groups will not count those kinds of incidents. With Islamophobia, groups like CARE are trying to capture a picture, but we know that there has been documented a case underreporting in Muslim communities of things that they're actually experiencing. So whenever we talk about these kinds of phenomenon, we have to take into account what's actually coming to us and what we're actually missing. I actually had not heard of the incident about the women in Wilmington that had been, someone attempted to run over. I knew about the case in Palo Alto, but I did not know that. So there's just so much that's been happening in the last year in relation to the war that's been made everything so much worse. It's not that Islamophobia began with the war or began with 9/11. These are, moments or events where the volume gets turned up essentially on phenomena that have long, deep histories, right? We can think about the roots of Islamophobia beginning in 1942 if you want to. You can go very deep, right? And of course, anti-Semitism is right there in 1492, so they're being constituted together. I think right now, in the context of the war, I'll just share that I think many campuses are grappling with how to be even-handed when you have students from different racial and religious communities, who feel vulnerable and targeted and are experiencing trauma, pain, and discrimination, racism. And I think that one of the ways I've been thinking a lot about institutional voice and what institutions say. And so often what the move is for the institution to say, anti-Semitism is a problem and we're addressing it, and we're also addressing Islamophobia. The problem is that, like, making the other twin of anti-Semitism Islamophobia, we're glossing over the very real phenomenon of anti-Palestinian racism, which is not the same thing as Islamophobia. So my daughter's in high school, her administrators in her high school immediately wanted to create like a Muslim students support group. And she had to teach her own administrators that the Arab students at your school are Palestinian, but they are not Muslim. They are Palestinian Christians. There's just such a gap in understanding. And that, when we think about the war, which is a very divisive issue, on my own campus, Jewish students on my campus are very divided. Many of them are, pro-Palestinian or anti-Zionist Jewish students, and others are pro-Israel and identify as Zionist students. So it's not as though religion is the line necessarily that's the fracture point, right? These things are complex. So many of the people that are experiencing anti-Palestinian racism are themselves Jewish students. So if we think about what is anti-Palestinian racism, there's an article in Jewish Current several years ago talking about how to name anti-Palestinian bigotry. And the author quotes my colleague, Meznaqatu, who basically says, anti-Palestinian racism has multiple factors, prejudice and hostility or discrimination against Palestinians has these different criteria. So denying the Nakba, which is something students encounter all the time in the classroom. Did the Nakba happen? Was it a genocide, or was it simply a reaction to the war? The fact that the Nakba began before the creation of Israel, right? That's one thing. Accusing Palestinians or their allies of latent racism or anti-Semitism, as Kayla was just getting out, without cause. Right? Many of us who have been critical of Israel have been accused of being anti-Semitic purely for criticizing the state of Israel. And then, of course, the exception, having this kind of Palestine exception when it comes to free speech, when it comes to all the other things that everyone else is granted, Palestinian students or Palestinian people and their allies are exempted from that, right? And so these are the kinds of things that are very specific to anti-Palestinian racism. And oftentimes what's happening on campuses is that the administrators are reaching out to talk to the Muslim Student Association rather than the Students for Justice in Palestine group, because they see the Muslim group as representing. So it's similar to what Kayla was saying, is where, this injustice when certain Muslims are seen as the natural representatives of the community. So in other words, post 9/11, brown Muslims became like real Muslims, and Black Muslims were invisibilized for a long time in that period. So the same way now, it's Palestinians and Arab American students that are often invisibilized, and it's the South Asian, often Muslim students, who are being privileged and brought in to represent all Muslims on campus, and they're often less, Muslim student associations have not, frankly, been leading the fight of the anti-war movement that we're seeing on campuses. It is Students for Justice in Palestine, JVP, and other student activist groups, but they are institutionally often basically pushed to the side because religion is somehow privileged as the kind of primary category. Now, of course, there are many Muslim students associations that are very much involved in the anti-war organizing. And so that in some cases, it is Islamophobia that we're talking about. But I'm just talking about my own campus and many other campuses that I'm familiar with. I am very concerned about the ways in which South Asian Muslims in particular are brought in as the kind of respectable Muslims to speak on this issue, as opposed to giving Palestinian Americans or Palestinians, the opportunity to speak on the what I would say is a genocide of their homeland.
Thank you. Dr. Wheeler, are there any thoughts or any reaction to what Dr. Graywell said?
I definitely agree. And I think one area where I would like to see more activism around Islamophobia is with the genocide in Sudan, which is being funded by a Muslim government. I think when we just focus on religion, which we racialize, so Islam means brown. So when we're talking about Palestinian, it's the brown Muslims. We ignore the other crises that are happening simultaneously and interconnected.
Thank you. Thank you. Our time is going by quick, and I just have maybe one or two more questions because we want to open this up to the audience that has taken the time to be here today, and we want to hear from you. We're an academic institution. You all work in an academic institution, and we actually, I think, have some leaders from our academic institution or others here on the chat. Tala, as a student, has this question: how might Islamophobia present itself or anti-Muslim bias in higher education?
Yes. Lots of different ways, just to start off with that. But one, intimidation. So I'm coming in from this as the Islamophobia. Again, I really like that term, anti-Muslim racism, because when I say Islamophobia, I'm talking about how Islamophobia presents itself in higher education institutions in a structural way. So not just my classmate calling me ISIS in our class. One way is, intimidation. I know I have experienced this, and other people in my university have experienced this, as I'm sure any person with a voice on Muslim issues has also experienced this across the U.S., where we will be intimidated economically. So like universities will say, hey, if you keep advocating for Muslims, say our connection to land in Western Asia, you are here on a scholarship that requires you to be in good standing. And because I am the dean who oversees code of conduct, I can make a report that you should no longer be seen as in good standing due to your advocacy. So that there goes your scholarship. We also see Islamophobia in the curriculum. So anybody here who's like into STEM, we have the Pythagorean theorem named after the European scholar Pythagoras. But then we also have the law of cosines that doesn't have anyone's name attached to it, even though it was Muslims in Persia like Al-Kashi and Al-Khawarizmi, but there's no accreditation there. The same with my major, social work. There's a ton of that. Sigmund Freud is dubbed the father of psychology, another European man. When he factually did not pioneer anything. He shared his perspective on concepts that were pioneered by Muslims such as Ibn Khaldun. So the Islamophobia, this is also something I'd like to highlight, is because it's so systemic, it's also it's harmful to everybody, Muslim and non-Muslim. So now, like, if you need a therapist, if you need a social worker, if you experience trauma, if you're in a public school, if you're incarcerated, you are going to be given services by someone who only ever learned the European side of history. And then the last thing I'll just say about this is, like, just because I have to, as part of like a respect to my peers in school, is when universities invest in organizations whose, let me read this, whose mission statements are to provide electronic warfare and special warfare weapons to use against Muslim majority countries. So there's an organization which I won't name, but is out there and it's public, that Indiana University will invest in it with our tuition money I don't know what my college student money is going to do anything with weapons. So especially considering it is reinforcing anti-Palestinian and anti-Arab nationalities.
Thank you. I thought it was very important to hear your perspective. I think as a student that we can learn from. Dr. Wheeler, how might Islamophobia present itself in your experience if you've had this situation in higher education, and how can higher education deal with it better?
So I would say surveillance, number one, and I can give a personal example. At the beginning of the fall semester, we had an MSA meet and greet with ice cream, and there were a whole bunch of new Muslim students and their friends, and it was just a nice hangout, everybody introducing themselves. And two older white men walked into the room with polos on and just stood to the back, taking notes, not interacting with anyone. Eventually, our Muslim chaplain came to introduce herself. Turns out this was the chief of police and the public safety officer who had been there listening the entire time and have continued to harass Muslim students and Muslim staff members on campus. So you see those kind of overt ways, but seeing when administrators choose to follow code of conducts. So our university MSA, they were audited for posting a pro-Palestine Instagram post. So someone came in to make sure that they were following their constitution, to make sure that they were collecting all of the receipts when they were having events. So these kind of subvert ways to silence people or scare them into not really speaking out. And I think it's a lot harder for people at public universities where citizens can get access to your emails and see any kind of organizing you're doing, any kind of teaching you're doing. So it really pushes faculty members and students and staff underground to think of new ways of organizing or just educating, talking about what's going on in the news or what's going on in their classrooms, because you don't know who is watching you and who might pull up these receipts and use them against you later on.
Thank you. Dr. Grewal, I'd like you to respond, but before that, I also want to mention in about 2 minutes, we're going to go to question period with the audience. So if you could kindly post your questions in the Q&A forum, and we'll try and get to as many as we can, if possible. Dr. Grewal, do you have a response or some thoughts you'd like to to
Yeah,
share?
I mean, these are really troubling accounts, and I'm very, very disturbed, and I think that very real experiences of I mean, this moment on campuses has been so humanizing to see this incredible anti-war movement, to see, which is multi-faith and multiracial. At the same time, there are this incredible dehumanizing experiences that have been happening for the last year, and of course, much longer than that. I guess one of the things that I just want to say, because this is a religion and conversation, one of the surprises for me, honestly, if I'm being totally frank, is that the outsized role of chaplains' offices in university on campuses. It just, the ways in which power, the Muslim chaplains are put into the corner. They are often answering to, they have bosses who may be hostile to their views. They're made responsible to be the point person to kind of manage students, and they're in a much more, they're much more afraid for their jobs. I mean, the premise or the face of it, it seems as if, oh, okay, well, the university is handling anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and every other kind of discrimination. Well, we just have a leaked audio from the president of the University of Michigan, my alma mater, where he says that, look, in practice, we are taking these claims of anti-Semitism very seriously, and there are, in fact, more claims about Islamophobia, and it's just not what we're focused on. So, that is not a surprise to any Muslim on any campus. We know that. We live it. We experience it every day, that this is not an institutional priority. And so, what's being done to rectify that?
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your perspective. If I can, I'd also now like to start sharing some of the questions that have been posed, and others, please feel free to post your questions. The first one, and any one of you can jump into this. So today, what do you believe is the main contributor to the rise in contemporary Islamophobia? Obviously, this is not a new phenomenon, especially given 9/11, and we saw the surge there at that time, and then back up again today. So what is driving the surge today, particularly in the last year?
The war. That's what I would say, very simply, the war.
I can jump in here. I would say it's decades and decades of what is pushed into the culture when you dictate what books people can read, and like enforcing book bans and approving what can be shown in like television and movies, and painting Muslims in a specific way. Like the concept of the natural, I forgot what we were calling it, but the natural looking Muslim, or the deserved looking Muslim. I feel as a result of our American media, when our terrorists in television shows have always been shown to look like a certain demographic, ever like long before the 90s. I'm sorry, 9/11. We have seen this rhetoric. So like seeing that build, and then 9/11, that demographic also committed crimes. So then that was just like it set Islamophobia at much higher rates. And then we had in 2016 a president who was again reinforcing a lot of those stereotypes and implementing policies like the Muslim ban, and essentially because of his influence, giving people on the ground level to perpetrate Islamophobia without any, fear, at least, of accountability. Because if the person at the very, very top is doing it, then why can't the rest of us? So we see that, and then today, I do believe though, like standing with Palestine, saying that phrase, pre or post 9/11 like was almost unheard of, obviously outside of the Muslim community. I'm talking about like seeing so many allies was it was foreign. Like I know for my parents experiencing this because they were about close to my age when 9/11 happened, like in my age group, and it was a much different scene. Today, people are much more, like, at least seemingly open to speak out against it. And I do feel like that's because since it's the media that's telling us this like story, and now we have access much more, like the internet is much more accessible. We are able to be more critical nowadays and like able to find out alternative information. We can get information directly from Palestinians in Palestine now, which is like never been a thing historically. We were able to get that during the Nakba, at least not on this scale. So I think now we are seeing a shift in that. But I do believe that historically it's always been from the same thing, from this painted picture in media, in songs, in television shows, books, of course, the news.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. We have a question here that I'd like to ask. As a historian of religion in the States, I hope that Islamophobia could be lessened by a stress on common religious elements between Muslims, Christians, and Jews. As a trans person, I like to point out that Abraham pleaded with God not to destroy Sodom for half of Genesis 18, and often referred to his wives. Can teaching religious history bring peace? Who wants to tackle this important question? Thank you, Dr. Wheeler.
So this is something I take very personally. I'm teaching a theology department, and I'm a part of the interfaith studies concentration. I hate interreligious dialogue. I think what it is kind of Christians patting themselves on their back. I think a lot of what the goals of interreligious dialogue say is to find common ground, but many times it's through a Christian lens. And I don't know if it necessarily humanizes people. I think we need to take into account that, yes, we have some commonalities, but the experiences of Muslims and Jewish people in this country are very, very, very different than Christians. Christians have not been oppressed here on a structural level, like take aside Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses and even Catholics in some cases. If you just focus on all of these commonalities, you're not paying attention to the structural barriers that are the reason why we see rises in hate crimes against Muslims. So I think what we need to do is have Christians look at how Islamophobia and anti-Semitism comes up in their own teachings and their own practices, doing some of their introspection. One thing that's been important to me is looking at Black Zionism. A number of like Black Christians who, it's really confusing to me, but totally embrace the idea of Israel instead of Palestine, because we have been brought up to want our own Zion and not understanding how harmful that is and what happened when we did try to seek out Zion in Liberia. And that's something that Ta-Nehisi Coates talks about in his new book.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your response. We have some other very important questions. So one comment is racism is more overt today than it was in 2001. And this next question, and if it's possible, I know you could do a whole class on each one of these questions, maybe keep it a minute because we're getting more questions that are coming. Dr. Grewal shared how campuses are ignoring Islamophobic incidents, at least it appears to be that way. What are the causes of that beyond just being ignorant? That's the word of the question.
So I don't think that Islamophobic incidents are being ignored wholesale, but what I was just mentioning, the leaked audio from the president of the University of Michigan, where he essentially confesses that, we are not being even-handed. Whatever we say And so I just wanted to highlight that's, that's not a surprise. It's an experience that many people have. I actually don't believe that Islamophobia comes from ignorance. I don't think, like, I was actually like Talha's parents. I was a young person, young adult, right after 9/11. And I was part of all of those Muslim open houses at mosques. And I was explaining the 5 pillars and doing all of that. And I thought, okay, we'd have all these people come in and be like, I don't know much about Islam. Teach us. And I would do all the stuff that Kayla is, gesturing at, which is like, Islam is monotheistic, Abraham, what, all of that stuff, right? And you know what? I don't think it did anything. I don't think it does a thing. It doesn't help, because what we know is that, while there is some evidence, there is studies have been shown that people who don't think they know a Muslim are more inclined to have, anti-Muslim racist thinking. It's not the case. That the root of Islamophobia is ignorance about Islam. Islam is on the news all the time. Muslims are on the news all the time. And somehow people manage to never learn anything about it. I'm teaching a course right now on U.S. cultural history, and teaching Melanie McAllister's Epic Encounters, a U.S., it's a Middle East history book, U.S. Middle East history book. And what she argues in that book is that Americans have this determined incomprehension. Every conflict in the Middle East is represented as spontaneous, irrational, and without a history. If you're starting, the real reason we're having this rise in Islamophobia is because some people believe that history began on October 7th. And that's not what the people that Talha's describing, who are looking for other sources beyond the institutionalized media or legacy media, are learning. My feeling is that the best way to teach anti-Zionism is to simply teach the primary sources from Zionist thinkers. And that is actually what makes students think, what do I think about ethno-nationalism? I don't need them to rehearse the 5 pillars to me, or the Sunni Shia split, or any of the other things. That's not what's going to help them in this moment. They need to understand, how is anti-Muslim racism or how is anti-Palestinian racism related to settler colonialism? We just had Indigenous Peoples Day. All of the things that are happening in our phones in Gaza happened on the land that we are having the Zoom call on, to peoples that were indigenous to this land. What's the connection there? Liberia is a great example. How can we think about other historical cases? This is a political problem. Religion is relevant, but it is not, religious trivia is not the solution.
Thank you. We have another question here, very important question given the election. It is, can we discuss the implications of Islamophobia in the upcoming election? Because of time, I'll shorten this a little bit. What does this mean for the future of the Muslim voter and the utility of Islamophobia in garnering votes for Democrats and Republicans? That's a complex question. Any thoughts on that? Go ahead, Talha.
I can attempt this one. So, okay, you're gonna hate me, whoever asked this question, because I'm not gonna answer it directly. So for me, I'm gonna tie this back to curriculum and really everywhere else that Islamophobia shows up. And then tie back to your question. So Islamophobia, like if I am studying social work and I'm reading out of a textbook that is Islamophobic, and then I go to complain to my university because they're doing a curriculum revision, and they take out, miraculously, they're able to identify where there's all the Islamophobia that's in this textbook, so they take it all out. This book is still useless to me because it is still anti-Black and it is still anti-Indigenous. I am not going to be able to offer holistic services as a social worker if I'm still learning from a book that is anti-Black or anti-Indigenous, ableist, all the isms. And I see our politics as the same way. Part of this like individualistic mindset is that like if the president can make sure I'm safe, then that's a good president. And that's not something that's gonna like ever work for me or really anyone that comes from collectivist communities, because the president may not be Islamophobic, they may be Islamophobic, but if they're not Islamophobic, but they're still anti-Black or they're sexist or they're ableist, if my next door neighbor is going to have to fear for their safety. I'm not supposed to be living comfortably, even if, they're not, the president isn't like specifically spewing hate against me or my identity. So I feel like it's worth mentioning that, like, we've lived under a Democratic party for the last 4 years, but I'm in a red state, Indiana, and I have lived under many Republican policies, majority Republican policies, which goes to show how important more local elections are. If I know this is like talking about Islamophobia and I'm diving into policy here, but like, we talk, there's so much talk about the mayor, the governor, and the president, and that's kind of intentional. And this is another narrative that our media has painted, but like the people that actually affect our everyday lives and safety is our like Congress people and state officials. Of course, when it comes to foreign affairs, which is very relevant to this conversation, that is when the president is is much more like involved in decision making. So when you have both that are investing in Palestine's occupying entity, then that's when you see, which you're seeing this now, people who are pro-Palestine, Muslims starting to withhold their vote because they feel like that is their only influence in this area. Other people will do like political advocacy. Some people will just take to the streets and do protests and stand in front of the White House. But both of our options here when it comes to foreign affairs are very similar.
Dr. Greenwald, any comments with respect to, or Dr. Wheeler, we only have like 2 minutes left, as to the upcoming election and anti-Muslim bias that has certainly, as we know, been used by some candidates. Any thoughts on?
Kayla, do you want to go first?
Yeah, it's nothing new. I think it would be useful for Muslims to lean on the Black radical tradition and divest from electoral politics and focus on mutual aid and community building. I don't think you can actually run for VP and be an anti-imperial candidate of the United States.
I mean, I do think, one of the things that we sometimes forget is that before 1979, the bad Muslims were Black Muslims, and world Islam or global Islam was seen as sort of benign and, Orientalist, whatever, kind of the way many people, I don't know. I mean, it's just seen it as an Eastern religion, basically, whatever that means. It's after 79 that suddenly Black Muslims become largely invisible in dominant American discourses, and then brown Muslims become the bad Muslims. So this is a weird moment when we have two third-party candidates that have both chosen Black Muslim VP options, and that tells us something about the way this racial politics is shifting. I have to say, I know Muslims are having hot debates about who to vote for: Stein, Trump, Harris, West, and I actually I'm thinking about writing an op-ed, because the only thing that I really care about, I'm very sad actually to see the number of Trump signs in a place like Dearborn, Michigan, which I stumped for Bernie, Bernie in Dearborn, and it was a very left-leaning voter population at that time. It has really swung right. That makes me sad as a leftist myself. But I have to say, for me, it's all about Michigan, because Muslims really only live in 10 states. By the grace of God, a couple of those are swing states. So those Muslims have an outside importance as voters in this country for the American Ummah, or national Muslim community. And Michigan in particular is going to be read as the Muslim vote, even though, of course, most Arabs in Michigan are not Muslim, they're Christians. But regardless, because of the symbolic meaning of Michigan, and it is a swing state, I want those votes to go to third-party candidates if they're going to vote. I don't want to see them go to Trump, but I also don't want to see Harris. I want the Democratic Party to understand the cost of what their complete failure to engage the uncommitted movement and the cost of that, and they have to feel that cost, otherwise they will never take Muslim voters seriously. So that's what to say. All I really care about is how Muslims in Michigan vote.
I want to thank you for this dialogue, Dr. Grewal, Talha Kaf, and Dr. Wheeler, and also the large number of participants that joined today at a very busy time of the day. So thank you. We were deeply honored that you came to our presentation. We would like to thank the panelists, the Center for Religious Studies and American Culture, the Liberal School of Arts. And also, we want to state that there will be a short survey on a few questions you have on topics you would like to see in the future. You will receive a link shortly. And stay tuned for Religion and Aftermath of 2024 election next month. And the recording of this webinar will be available on our YouTube and podcast platforms next week. Thank you so very much, panelists, and thank you, Talha, and thank you to Dr. Joseph Edmonds for his wonderful work in organizing such forums. Thank you so much.
Yeah.